So this is the Akin Prairie. It's a species-rich, native virgin prairie. It's never been plowed. It's been managed as a hay meadow. It has 220 species. And it's been rich and wonderful like this since 10,000 years ago. Somewhere after the glaciers retreated and prairies moved in, and this land is essentially unchanged. Around it's greatly changed. I mean, if you were standing here 200 years ago, you wouldn't see any trees. Now trees have encroached, but this prairie, because it's cut for hay and is well managed, is species rich. So I'm going to talk about a bunch of species here, and I'm going to start with this one, which is called rattlesnake master, and the scientific name, and I won't give all the scientific names, but is Rangium yuccafolium, because that leaf looks like yucca, and it's an odd carrot family plant. It's called rattlesnake master because the plant was used to master the rattlesnakes. The Fox or Muskogee Indians believed both that the plant itself could help deter rattlesnakes, and then a medicine was made from the root as a rattlesnake antidote. And we still don't have good rattlesnake antidotes, so someone should look at this plant and Echinacea and others as an opportunity to develop some new medicines for us. I do want us to look at the landscape for just a minute. This is the year of yellow-orange. All these black-eyed Susans. One right here across the landscape. Black-eyed Susans are a pretty wildflower a lot of people grow. It's had some uses for tea, but it's not a major food or medicinal plant. But it's pretty and really easy for people to grow. Prairies are primarily grass landscapes. So in terms of the cover of land here, the greatest cover is grasses. And tallgrass prairies are known for having big and little bluestem Indian grass, switchgrass, cytotsgrama, and this one right here, which is called eastern gamagrass. It's a relative of corn. In fact, the flowering head looks a lot like a corn tassel. It's considered the ice cream of pasture grasses in terms of grazing, and usually disappears from pastures. Most of our cattle grazing is too intense for the wildflowers to persist, and in some cases even for the grasses. So you rarely find eastern gamagrass on prairies anymore. It was historically a food source, has big seeds. They have really tough husks around them, but it's collected by native people millennia ago for food source. It's New Jersey tea. New Jersey tea is called that because this plant occurs all the way to the East Coast. Its claim to fame is as a tea, and when the leaves are dried, pea spat like that with dried leaves boiled in water for 3 to 5 minutes makes a really tasty tea. It's as good as black tea in terms of taste. And this was the plant that was used as a tea substitute after the Boston Tea Party. And so people switched to using New Jersey tea. But there are a couple problems that occurred. First of which, New Jersey tea doesn't have caffeine. And many of us really like getting caffeine in the morning. So that ultimately didn't work, and the plant kind of lost enthusiasm. And also at that time, the Boston Tea Party generated people looking for other plants, and people started importing coffee. So coffee boomed after the Boston Tea Party, and we kind of gave up on New Jersey tea. It's a long-lived plant. Its roots are medicinal. It's a great ornamental. It's woody. It's actually a shrub and has a woody root. Various species called red root, which was used a lot for medicinal purposes. Nearby, we have a plant I really like called goat's rue. And if you can look at that flower, it's just got this great pink and yellow flower. And it really would be a nice one to use as ornamental, but it's hard to propagate. We don't see it elsewhere. It's one of the plants out here. There's many. A lot of these I've been showing that you do not find anywhere except on high quality prairies. This is not a plant you find in a brome field. You don't find this on roadsides unless you happen to have a prairie roadside. You don't find it coming up in people's backyards or waste areas. It's only found on prairies. So we're down to maybe 50 or 100 sites in Douglas County. And this one also likes sandy soils. It's apparently goats don't like it. It's what's called goat's rue. Bean family plant. Really pretty. And this one is a Lespedeza. It's one of our native Lespedeza, rabbit-foot's Lespedeza. The little top here is a little bit soft and fuzzy. Maybe it's like a rabbit's foot. It's a lagoon family plant, and it's important for wildlife. Has big seeds, quail, pheasants, others like it. Seeds have some odd compounds, so it's not a good human food, but it's used a lot in conservation plantings and is very, very beneficial to wildlife. So this is Echinacea, Echinacea pallida, one of my favorite plants, probably my favorite plant. And I've studied and written extensively about all the Echinacea, which were the most widely used medicine by Native Americans across the Great Plains, Midwest. We've now documented over 18 different tribes that use this as a medicine. It was used for snake bites. It was used when people feel sick. It was used for problems with blood. It had all sorts used topically for skin problems, for healing wounds. It was a cure-all of all sorts. Now we find this plant has an immune stimulant in it. In fact, it has more than one. And immune stimulants help strengthen the body, maybe help you resist getting a virus, which might be a good thing, or resist getting infection. So we know that there's a response by this immune stimulant, and there's immune stimulant in the carbohydrate fraction of this plant. But if you take this plant and you remove all the carbohydrate, there's immune response to the rest of the plant. So we know that there's more than one substance in here, and we have something we call polypharmacy, that there's several things happening at the same time that potentially can affect the human body. This has been studied a lot, but still scientists, chemists have not been figure out exactly the designation, the formulation of that large polysaccharide. So it's somewhat confusing. This plant's so popular right now, you can't even hardly buy it. With concerns about viruses being extreme, the supplies of this have dwindled. Would it cure the coronavirus? No, but it might help you resist getting sick. Maybe 5%, maybe 1%, maybe a little more. We've not studied that. It'd be a great thing to study. There's been concerns about Echinacea disappearing. There's been so much harvested. I've documented millions of plants being dug up. So there are conservation concerns. In some places, plants that's been dug up on reserves, which is really bad. So in some cases, people are really concerned about overharvest. We've done work. We've gone out with diggers who dig it in western Kansas and up in Montana, and we found that after they had reported it keeps coming back, that when harvested, and they take 6 to 8 inches of root, 50% of those plants come back. So there are realms of harvest that would be sustainable. So if there's an occasional harvest, the plant will pop back, which is kind of a relief. Not that it should be harvested in beautiful hay meadows, but there are probably places where it's abundant enough in the wild. Out in the high plains, you'll find places where you can still see tens of thousands of plants. And in some of those places, it can be harvested sustainably. Have to speak about the wild rose, the prairie rose. Gotta put my nose in it. Oh, there's very little that smells so sweet as a wild rose. Roses were particularly important to Native folks. The Rosebud Reservation in South Dakota, where Lakota live. Rose hips were a food, an emergency food at times. The inner bark of the rose, below the spiny stems, was used as an eye medicine. Traditionally, when people cooked over wood fires all the time, you can imagine there were a lot more eye problems we have now. So the compounds in the rose stems were soothing and helped with some of the eye problems that people had. It's a difficult plant to grow at home, but it's worth trying, and if one is able to find some on the roadside, you can move long rhizomes. One of the big losses in my life was our work at the Akin Prairie. We lost the Akin Prairie, the plow and development, but I was able to rescue some wild roses, and I still have those in my yard. So the other remnant I have of the Akin Prairie is I have wild roses from the Elkins. So this is the wild potato, Apios tuberosa, Apios americana, also called groundnuts. This is one of the most important wild foods of Native people. It's hardly recognized. It was known it was abundant in floodplains. In fact, the town of Topeka is a Kaw name that translates as a good place to grow potatoes. And they were referring to toe, T-O, or dough in the Osage language, nu in the Omaha language, which refers to this plant. And this viney legume would cover wet areas, wet ravines and wet meadows all through our river valleys. Well, those areas have been plowed for agriculture, and this plant was favorite for grazing. It's been grazed out of most places. It was so abundant, though, that even the military wrote about this plant is good for grazing horses. And if you had horses, you would just tie them up in these wet areas, and they would eat this and love it and eat grass. And it has these wonderful tubers that are the size of an egg, or a little smaller, and they're tasty. They're a little bit peanutty when raw. They're better cooked or baked. They were gathered extensively by native peoples. There's been a little bit of work on these to grow them, make them a commercial crop, but they're kind of wild. They like to spread. You can't contain them in a garden bed easily. The French did extensive research on them too, and others, but they've not really become a commercial crop. But they're really nutritious, being a legume. They're high in protein, and they're a fascinating plant. This is a great plant. This is compass plant, and you can see with the sun shining in that most all these leaves are facing north-south. And my friend and colleague Craig Martin, botany department at the University of Kansas, studied these plants and found out that 85% of the leaves are pretty close to due north-south. And why does this plant do this? Well, one explanation is when the settlers and early folks came out, they were lost on the prairies. They needed a plant that would tell them which way to go. And if that's north and south, then you know which way west is. But now that doesn't hold up too well. The more scientific reason is prairies have so much sunlight that most plants out here get too much. In fact, they lose water, and losing water is a bigger issue than getting enough sun. Most of the grasses have vertical leaves, and this is trying to have vertical leaves. So it's trying to avoid the midday heat and sun and gets plenty of light by putting up its leaves vertically. Compass plant is a sunflower relative, has nice flowers, big plant. It's a favorite plant of Aldo Leopold, who wrote about it. And one of the native uses is that the sap from the plant was used as a chewing gum. So it's sticky and really made a nice gum. Another plant here, not in bloom yet, is one of our gay feathers or blazing stars. This is the tall liatris. So they have wonderful thick spikes of purple flowers here. In a little bit, not this species, but related liatris have edible roots, which are used as food. It's a fun one. Another plant that I love to pass around and let people smell it, but this is slender mountain mint, and it has a mint smell. And it varies. Now it's getting hot. It's not as sweet as it was. The mint plants are affected by heat and drought. So this plant's not as sweet, but it still would make a very nice tea. You know, and something like that amount would be more than enough leaves for making a tea. Just pour boiling water over it and you have a nice tea. Another plant that is fun is this cat claw sensitive briar. Has these wonderful pink, there's a really nice one, flowers. It's a mimosa, made of mimosa trees. And what's even more unique about the plant is when I touch these leaves, you can actually see them fold. So I'm going to snap that leaf with my finger, and you can see it shuts. It responds. It's an obedient plant. And they shut their leaves, and I believe the plant does this as another reason to keep from drying out. You get windy days out in the prairie, and if it's windy, you're going to lose moisture in your leaves. So if the wind shakes your leaves and you close, then that protects you from losing as much moisture. This plant's small. We're going to get bigger. This is called Culver's root. It has these wonderful leaves that encircle the stem all at the same point. It's a nice ornamental. It'll get up about 3 feet tall. It's one of the rare plants out here in the prairie. There's only a few clumps of it, named after Dr. Culver. It was an important medicine in early medical use in the 1800s, 1900s in the U.S. used as a purgative to clean out your system. We don't do much of that anymore unless you like consume poison or something, but we don't believe in doing that. It's also an immune stimulant used by many tribes. One of the great things about being in Lawrence and teaching at KU is having students to interact with from Haskell. I just learned a couple of years ago that this plant still be used by Native folks on their reservations for an important medicine, particularly up in the Great Lakes area. So a lot of still active use of medicinal plants. This is Mead's milkweed. This is definitely the find of the day. This is our endangered species. This is a plant that's threatened, federally protected, although that doesn't mean anything on private property. This prairie, because it's a rich prairie, because it's not had much of a history of grazing, treated as a hay meadow, been very well managed, this plant's persisted. We're down to a couple hundred plants known. Only a few in this part of the state, and this is one of the sites. This is in full bloom. Mead's milkweed is an interesting plant. We know it's long-lived, it's rhizomatous. This one here probably is connected to these. These two are connected. So you have a root network, and they send up flowering stalks. This year is a wet year. I thought I'd find a lot of them. I'm not seeing many at all. They're hard to see. They're hard to find. So we talk about you have to have MEDAR, like radar eyes to see these. The plant is slow growing, so we do try to grow it from seed. This plant is probably, I would even think, maybe decades old. We grow them from seed and you get a 10-inch plant that's 3 years old. We transplant them out, they just don't do well. They're even hard to grow from seed. They don't make many seeds. Most plants that flower make no seeds. There's pollination problems. If they make seed, they make a pod. The pods don't always fill. The pods have to be on the plant until September for them to mature, so they're not making many seeds. We don't find plants coming up hardly anywhere. We don't find them except on these really nice prairies. They're like milkweed seeds. They float in the air. They just don't seem to move very easily. So you'd have to go extreme lengths to propagate them, growing them in a greenhouse, taking care of them for a few years and putting them out, or we need to protect more prairies where these wonderful plants occur. I don't really know of any uses of them. They're so rare, there's not much recorded in history. They're milkweed, they're slightly toxic. They're tender plants. We don't know why, but they disappear on pastures that are grazed. We hardly ever, almost never, find them in places that are grazed for longer periods of time.
I'm wrong if you want to talk to.
Yeah, so this is a spittle bug. This insect makes spit, or I don't know, foam, and it protects itself. It keeps itself moist, and it does like the sap of the plant. It's hidden in there. You can see it because that dark spot's where the little insect is, and he's not crawling out of there. But it protects itself, so it doesn't dry out, and you'll see these little pieces of spit in all sorts of species. It's not, doesn't seem to be too species specific. I see it in lots of different types of plants, and it's eating just a little bit on these leaves. This is Spiderwort. It's such a wonderful flower. Now there's lots of varieties and even other species that people grow in gardens. Believe it or not, it's an edible plant. All parts of the plant are edible, but I wouldn't use it. It's too pretty, and it's mucilaginous. I mean, one of the common names for it's cow slobbers, because if you break a leaf, you can't quite see it. But there's this goo that's on my fingers already, kind of shiny. So it's full of mucilage, which is healthful. I mean, it's good for us to have mucilaginous compounds, but it's too pretty to eat. But it's a wonderful plant and a wonderful ornamental. And let me talk about this daisy fleabane, which you see all over. Here's a better one over here. This plant you would recognize. This is one of those plants that does grow all over. It's a native plant. It's a compositae. It's in the sunflower, aster family. And it's ubiquitous. You'll find it in roadsides, you find it in brome fields, you find it in prairies. You don't find it in deep woods, but anywhere that there's quite a bit of light, you find this plant that has these nice little white flowers. They're like stars. It's easy to grow. It is a weed because it grows all over. So that's kind of the little tour, Akin Prairie, little tour that I'm glad everyone's joining in on this. Please come out and visit. Thank you.